Welcome to Dark Legends, where we uncover the mysteries that history tried to keep hidden. In the summer of 1914, Europe plunged into the Great War, a conflict that no one could have imagined would drag on for years. Soldiers marched to battle, believing they would be home by Christmas. But by the end of that year, hundreds of thousands were dead, and the Western Front had ground to a deadly stalemate. The men in the trenches had long since abandoned the idea of a quick victory. Now, they fought for survival, knee-deep in mud and misery. The trenches were more than just defenses, they were prisons. Men lived surrounded by death. Artillery shells rained down, day and night, tearing the earth apart and shredding lives. Mud caked everything: clothes, weapons, food. Rats scurried across the bodies of the dead, and disease was rampant. Lieutenant Thomas Gibbons of the British Army huddled in the damp cold, writing to his wife by the light of a candle. "This war," he wrote, "is not as they told us it would be. They said it would be an adventure, a quick march into glory. But all I see is death, and I fear I may never see you again." Across no man's land, a young German soldier named Friedrich Bauer tucked a photograph of his mother into his coat, reminding himself that he fought for her safety. He stared out across the wasteland and wondered how many more would die before he could go home. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of bodies left out too long in no man's land. The cold bit into their bones, the wetness of the earth seeping through their uniforms. The sound of distant artillery was a constant, a reminder that death was always nearby. Thus, December 24th, 1914, Christmas Eve. For most, it was a day to gather with loved ones, to celebrate peace and goodwill. But here on the Western Front, it was another day of war. The soldiers on both sides prepared for another night in the trenches, huddling close for warmth, their thoughts drifting to memories of better times. Thomas thought of his wife, Mary, back in England. They had been married just a month before he left for the front. Every day, he carried her letters in his pocket, reading them whenever he could. Across no man's land, Friedrich's thoughts were on his family farm. He had grown up on that land, helping his father in the fields, and now he wondered if he would ever see it again. But then, something unexpected happened. From the German trenches, a faint sound emerged, a song. "Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht." The British soldiers listened in stunned silence. Was it real? The Germans were singing Christmas carols in the midst of war. Slowly, as if testing the waters, a British voice responded with Silent Night in English. Across no man's land, the two songs blended into one, rising above the war, above the fear. For Thomas, it was a reminder of home, of the Christmases spent with his family by the fire, singing the same song. But here, on the front, it felt out of place, almost like a dream. Could they really be singing with the enemy? Friedrich too felt the strangeness of it all. These men, who just hours earlier had been his targets, now joined him in song. What would happen next? The singing had broken the silence. But what would follow? As the singing faded, a new sound emerged, the sound of footsteps. A German soldier waving a white cloth stepped cautiously into no man's land. The British watched, hearts pounding. Was this a trick? Would the Germans open fire the moment they stepped out? Thomas felt his pulse quicken. His hand gripped his rifle, ready to defend himself if it came to that. But something in the German's body language told him this wasn't an ambush. Slowly, he rose from his trench, his hands empty. Other British soldiers followed, their movements slow and tentative. The two sides met in the middle, just a few feet away from the bodies of their fallen comrades. No one spoke at first, the silence heavy with uncertainty. Then, a German soldier offered a cigarette. A British soldier, after a moment's hesitation, accepted it. A handshake followed, then another. The ice was broken. For the first time in months, these men, soldiers, fathers, sons, brothers, looked into the eyes of their enemies and saw not monsters, but men just like themselves. The language barrier didn't matter. They shared what they had, chocolate, cigarettes, buttons from their uniforms. Laughter broke the tension. It felt strange, almost forbidden, to laugh in a place so steeped in death. The smell of smoke and wet earth hung in the air, but for the first time, it didn't feel oppressive. But as they shook hands and exchanged gifts, the question lingered. How long could this last? The officers had yet to intervene, but they surely would. Would they be forced to return to the fight once this fragile peace ended? Someone, no one is quite sure who, produced a football. Within minutes, a makeshift game had begun. Germans and British soldiers kicked the ball back and forth, their laughter echoing across the battlefield. For that brief moment, the war was forgotten. Thomas found himself running alongside Friedrich, chasing the ball with the same enthusiasm they had as boys back home. They didn't know each other's names, but it didn't matter. In this moment, they weren't enemies. They were just two young men, playing a game that reminded them of simpler times. But time was running out, the sun was setting, and with it the reality of war was creeping back in. They couldn't stay here forever. Soon the officers would call them back, and the fighting would resume. As darkness fell, the soldiers exchanged final handshakes and returned to their trenches. The Christmas Truce, as it would later be called, had come to an end. The officers, furious at the fraternization, ordered their men back into position. The war was back on. For Thomas, the return to the trenches felt heavier than before. He had seen the humanity in his enemies' eyes. How could he fire at them now? Across no man's land, Friedrich wrestled with the same thoughts. The war, once so clear in its purpose, now felt painfully confusing. The next day the fighting resumed. But something had changed. The men had shared a moment of peace. Would that moment stay with them, even as the war raged on? The Christmas Truce of 1914 was never repeated. As the war dragged on, the bitterness and hatred deepened. But those who were there, who shared that brief moment of peace, carried it with them for the rest of their lives. For Thomas, that Christmas became a touchstone, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could break through. Friedrich, too, carried the memory, writing about it in his diary, as a testament to the possibility of peace, even in war. The war would continue for 4 more years, claiming millions of lives. But the Christmas Truce stood as a reminder that peace, however brief, is always possible. And it left a question for future generations. If peace could be found on a battlefield, where else might it be possible? The truce was not just a fleeting moment. It became a symbol. Letters home from soldiers described the surreal experience, with some questioning the war's purpose after seeing the humanity of the enemy. But the higher command was quick to quash any future fraternization, issuing strict orders to avoid any interaction with the enemy. The war machine ground on. The Christmas Truce remains a powerful reminder of the potential for peace, even in the darkest of times. Memorials stand today to honor that brief moment when humanity overcame violence. For those who lived it, the memory was bittersweet, a reminder of what could have been had the war ended sooner.